Good morning. My name is Micah Watson. I direct the Paul Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics here at Calvin. I want to welcome you to this year's Pruis Rule of Law lecture. Whether you are here for the concluding session of the Kuyper Conference or the opening session of the Henry Symposium, we're delighted that you have joined us. This lecture is named in honor of Don Pruis, husband to Loris and the father of the accounting and business programs at Calvin. Don was the quintessential gentleman academic, according to one of his colleagues. He taught at Calvin for 36 years, contributing to the strength and enduring legacy of our business and accounting majors, now exemplified by the magnificent building just to the west of us that houses our new School of Business. Don passed away in the fall of 2017, but his name is still well represented on campus by his son and my colleague Dirk Pruis, who serves as Calvin's Chief Financial Officer and VP for Finance, and Don's granddaughter, Rory Pruis. I would also like to thank Ed and Ruth Zylstra, who established this lectureship as a way to honor Don. We're grateful for their generosity. The rule of law is an essential component of a free and flourishing society, and Don Pruis had an abiding interest in the rule of law, and thus this lecture series is one way of remembering him while encouraging us to foster appreciation for the rule of law. This brings us to our honored guest, who will help us do just that this morning. Dr. Anthony Bradley is a distinguished research fellow at the Acton Institute, just a few miles away, as well as a research professor of interdisciplinary and theological studies at Kuyper College, also not far away. Dr. Bradley has a strong presence not only in academic circles, but also in serving the church, as he was theologian in residence at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Lincoln Square in New York City, where he also taught at King's College for several years before coming back to Grand Rapids. He is an excellent teacher, having won Faculty of the Year at King's more than once, and a prolific scholar, authoring or editing over 12 books, some of which are available at the Acton Institute table outside. Some of his books include Ending Overcriminalization and Mass Incarceration, Hope from Civil Society from Cambridge University Press, John Rawls and Christian Social Engagement, Justice as Unfairness from Lexington, Why Black Lives Matter, African American Thriving for the 21st Century, and most recently, Heroic Fraternities, How College Men Can Save Universities in America from Whips and Stock. Perhaps the best compliment I can pay to Dr. Bradley is a comment I heard from a friend of mine who was a dean at Wheaton College when he heard that Anthony was giving the Pruis lecture. He said, "That guy, from everything I've heard, pours into the lives of his students in an unreal way." We're glad to have him here with us today. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Anthony Bradley?
Thank you so much for that introduction. I am excited to be here. There are a number of you that I am especially thrilled to meet because I've been using a few of your books and courses over the years, and I am particularly excited to be the via media between these two conferences this week. My apologies for not being here yesterday. I'm actually currently teaching a class on criminal justice at Kuyper College this semester, so I was doing a 3-hour seminar yesterday with students there. The title of this paper is Justice as Vengeance, Unpacking Kuyper's Antirevolutionary Ideals in Modern Law Enforcement. I want to expand that actually to criminal justice rather than simply law enforcement. Often people assume law enforcement is simply about the police, but I want to expand that more broadly to the criminal justice system. Now, by criminal justice, I mean a system of law enforcement adjudication and correction that is directly involved in the apprehension, prosecution, and control of those charged with criminal offenses, and the various local, state, and national agencies responsible for upholding and maintaining justice. In their comprehensive analysis of crime statistics in the United States for the year 2022, which is the most recent data set that we have, the Federal Bureau of Investigation revealed a nuanced landscape of criminal offenses through the Uniform Criminal Reporting Program, drawing from the extensive national incident-based reporting system and the summary reporting system. The data capturing about 11 million incidents, which indicates a nuanced shift in criminal patterns, with violent crime experiencing a decline for the second year in a row, which is really good news, dropping to 380.7 incidents per 100,000. Contrarily, however, the property crime rate recorded an uptick of 6.7%, which is bad news. But notably, the rate of larceny theft saw a significant increase of 7.4%, the first increase of this magnitude in the last 20 years. However, while the overall violent crime rates diminished across various categories, robbery incidents in particular have experienced significant increase. This system in this country is expensive. In terms of law enforcement and corrections expenditures for 2021, we witnessed the highest financial commitment since 1980. Adjusted for inflation, the federal, state, and local governments are allocating about $282 billion to America's criminal justice enterprise. Yet the ratio of police officers is per 100,000 population saw a decline of 8.9%. The correctional system scope in 2021 included approximately 5.6 million individuals in prisons, jails, and under probation or parole, despite an estimated 6.9 million admissions to jail throughout the year. The data further elucidates a consistent annual decrease in the proportion of state prisoners primarily charged with drug-related offenses since 2007, while the firearm death rate decreased to 14.5% per 100,000 in 2022. The U.S. has a complex criminal legal system comprising federal, state, local, and tribal systems, again with over 1.9 million people incarcerated across those various facilities. In a recent report, the aim was to clarify this data, this FBI data, the URC data, and the NIVRS data, to highlight what some are calling mass incarceration, or simply an explosion in America's incarceration enterprise. What's interesting about mass incarceration or incarceration in general is that local jails are typically overlooked as incarceration's front door and a significant impact on the criminal justice system. The pretrial detention capacity for jails in this country is about 475,000 people. Now, while economic factors also play a role in pretrial detention and arrests, with detained individuals tending to have lower incomes, what we now have a better understanding of today is the role of childhood trauma and neglect and its impact on neurological development and impulse control as predictors of criminal deviance more than we ever have in human history. So my question for this particular paper is, what would Abraham Kuyper's Antirevolutionary Party recommend for the United States, given this data, using the framework of our program published in 1879? But first, let me begin with a bit of background of the criminal justice philosophy of the Netherlands. According to PJP Tack in his 2008 book, The Dutch Criminal Justice System, The history of the present Dutch criminal code starts around 1810, when the Kingdom of Holland, under Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, was annexed to the French Empire, and the penal code for the Kingdom of Holland in force since 1809. It replaced the French Napoleonic Code Penal. After the restoration of independence in 1813, and after the Kingdom of the Netherlands was established in 1815, the French Code was kept in force provisionally, however, with some important changes. The sanction systems were reformed considerably. For instance, they abolished the deportation and also abolished lifelong forced labor. The 1813 Dutch Constitution stipulated that the main body of substantive and procedural criminal law is to be regulated in codes. During the 19th century, a number of draft criminal codes were proposed, but a lack of parliamentary unanimity on both those sanctions and those systems, and the prison system in particular, prevented adoption of any of these drafts. However, important revisions of the criminal code did take place, in particular regarding sanctions. The range of sentences was reduced to various forms of imprisonment, fines, suspension of certain rights, and forfeiture of certain goods. Corporal punishment was abolished in 1856, as was the death penalty in 1870. Instead, a life sentence was introduced. In fact, the ideals of the classical school of criminal law, prevalent in the French Code Penal, were gradually replaced by more modern 19th century ideals, which led to more humane sanctions and prisons. Dutch prisons of the time, mainly built in the 17th century, were compatible with those modern ideas. The prison regime was very harsh, with a focus on re-education. There was no differentiation in prisons according to age, term, or prison sentence, or whether the prisoner was a first offender or a recidivist. Imprisonment had a detrimental effect on prisoners who were not housed in individual cells but in common quarters. In 1823, the Dutch Association for the Moral Improvement of Prisoners, the forerunner of the present probation service, was established by a group of citizens. The aim of the association was the moral advancement of prisoners. The volunteers of the association tried to combat the threat of moral decay arising from the lamentable conditions in prison by visits, educational measures, religious instruction, and the supply of books. The Dutch Association played an important role in the final adoption of Parliament of the cellular prison system, also known in the U.S. as the Pennsylvania system model, which paved the way for the first truly national criminal code. In 1870, a penal law reform committee was established that drafted a criminal code, which together with an extensive explanatory memorandum was submitted to Parliament in 1879 by Mr. Moderman in his capacity as Minister of Justice. The criminal code, which is a long Dutch word, which I am not even going to try to pronounce, was adopted in 1881 and became into force in 1886 by a number of acts which had to be reformed as a new prison system based on the cellular prison system, which had to be built. Now, this timeline coincides precisely with the proposals made by Abraham Kuyper and the Antirevolutionary Party to begin the free Dutch society, to free the Dutch society from, quote, the ideology embodied in the French Revolution and the public philosophy known as secular humanism, Kuyper said. Kuyper sought to frame a criminal justice system that was distinctly Dutch, one that was Christian historical or anti-revolutionary. One aspect of this anti-revolutionary framing is seeing the reality of sin and its role in society. Quoting from Kuyper, sin is a divisive, darkening, and destructive force in every domain of human life, and not at least in the area of justice. End of quote. Kuyper continues, quote, that in defiance of prevailing ideas, and that by that he being secular humanist ideas, we pride ourselves on fine-tuning our convictions in accordance with the following propositions. Namely this: if God is truly God, then all determination of law proceeds from him. And all that remains for us to do is to ask what holy reverence for the road that can lead us to the purest knowledge of what God Almighty has stamped for justice for the whole of his creation as eternal justice for every creature. What is just is what extends from the ordinance of God and what he desires for his world. So Kuyper lays out the rule of law with respect to justice and criminal justice with the following propositions. All law that is to pass for just law on earth must pass the test of justice. God alone determines what is just in accordance with his holy being. Insofar as human life is concerned, pure knowledge and firmness of these divine ordinances were lost as a result of sin. The divine ordinances are derived from the revealed will of God. As such, a criminal justice system has to account for the sinfulness of human persons and the noetic effects of sin that have compromised our understanding of what to do about criminal deviance. That is, how to even create a criminal justice system and how it relates to crime control. For Kuyper, conceptions of justice are largely anthropological in nature. Kuyper agrees with the French author Jules Michelet that the birthplace of misunderstanding society is the denial of the fact of sin. Anthropologically speaking, humans are sinners. The eternal principles of justice, therefore, are derived from sinful minds. And those sinful minds need the Word of God for direction on the basis of law. If we view humans as merely, quote, underdeveloped creatures, end of quote, conceptions of justice might be helpful as far as they go, but they won't rely on the Word of God for its ultimate rule of God and will be deficient for a flourishing society. Kuyper's reference to the Word of God was not a theocratic framing, but one of guidance and prudence in light of the noetic effects of sin. In some ways, these represent a knowledge problem. That is, sinners need the revealed Word of God to guide them in understanding what justice demands, but not enshrined into law, one with respect to what the church might demand, but one that's enshrined in the consciences of the men and women who participate in the government's national criminal justice system and who construct those criminal laws. So in light of the anthropological and the noetic limitations on those in society and in civil authority, the Anti-Revolutionary Party's framing of criminal justice from Article 13 reads as follows. It desires from the sovereign that by means of an independent judiciary, accessible to all and in keeping with the moral sense of justice in the nation, and in accordance with laws founded on the eternal principles of justice, first, that it decide all disputes between parties, both civil and administrative law. Second, that it pronounce sentence against anyone who offends against the public order. And third, that it execute punishment of the convicted. not just to protect society or to improve the offender, but in the first place to restore violated justice, if need be, by the death penalty, which government in principle has the right to impose. The Anti-Revolutionary Party's criminal justice system is not a system too unlike the British and American systems of the same era. A criminal justice is retributive, and the purpose of prisons is to punish offenders. All of this for the sake of restoring justice. Kuyper is then keen to assert the importance of the rule of law as the priority for justice. Kuyper says, quote, "The highest and most sacred attribute of the sovereign is that he upholds justice. The fact that justice is, in any case, is the judgment that God himself, if he were to speak, would pass in regard to a case in point. It implies that he who maintains justice acts on behalf of God." End of quote. In Kuyper's framework, by extension, the following principles prevail. A justice must be impartial according to the law and kept from interference by higher governmental authorities as to protect criminal justice from bias, greed, pride, and so on. Number two, the sovereign, the one who has administrative oversight over the provincial areas, is the one who is and remains ultimately accountable to God. Principle three, the principles of justice should flow from the wisdom of these eternal principles outlined in the revealed will of God. A justice is not based on the opinions, the impure opinions of sinful people, but the certainty given by the quote, eternal, unchangeable principles of justice known only by means of special revelation. End of quote. The fourth principle is this, that judges will judge in complete freedom, quote, in order that justice is served in accordance with the laws of justice, and these laws should never be violated to please politicians. The fifth principle, as such, Kuyper wanted lower income people to have access to quality legal representation. To be sure, Kuyper says, quote, solicitors and attorneys are available to help the average person find his way. Because of income disparities, Kuyper notes that, quote, the effect is that a person of lower classes involved in a lawsuit with someone from higher classes almost always, despite the unimpeachable honesty of judges, is fighting a duel with highly unequal weapons. You might think of bringing a knife to a gunfight with a wealthy person. Kuyper focuses his anti-revolutionary framework on criminal proceedings on two pervasive topics, two of which drive the purpose and articulate what criminal justice is ideally about. The first is punishment, and secondly, the retention of the death penalty. Kuyper maintains that the purpose of imprisonment is punishment. Punishment, he says, quote, has to be first and foremost, also according to us, to strengthen justice, or if you will, to avenge violated justice. So again, the purpose of punishment, first and foremost, Kuyper says, is to strengthen justice or to avenge violated justice. Kuyper says this, and this is my favorite part, by the way, in our program. God's justice, insofar as it came to the expression in the country's laws, must be honored unconditionally. No one should dare to violate it, and whoever does violate it may not be spared, but most resolutely be seized by the avenging arm of justice. The obligation to do so rests on the sovereign. He is to hunt down the criminal with all the means at his disposal, causing him to be sentenced and having him undergo the pain that the law requires for upholding the honor of justice. Hunt the criminal down, says Kuyper. Make him feel the pain of the daring act of violating the public order. In other words, a crime deserves swift and immediate justice. Punishment is vengeance for violated justice, and this establishes the justification for the criminal justice system. Kuyper, recognizing the severity of the system, does not tolerate violations of public order. He's also quick to say immediately that criminal proceedings must ensure the following: that we punish only those who are truly guilty, and secondly, that the punishment be proportional to the crime. The goal is to maintain the rule of law and to protect criminal proceedings from corruption. Kuyper was to err on the side of the presumption of innocence while allowing prosecutors to present charges as freely as needed. What matters to Kuyper is that, quote, the sacred rights of innocence, end of quote, be maintained before carrying out a sentence and imposing a punishment. For Kuyper, what protects society from injustice is not the police, but justice itself. And what the sovereign is to protect in society is not society by definition, but the sovereign is there in his role to protect justice. Kuyper has very little confidence that incarceration changes people. He would not be much of a fan of today's correctional facility model here in the U.S. Kuyper observed, quote, the result of a conviction seldom leads to improvement of the criminal. In fact, it may well happen that justice demands a penalty that makes the transgressor worse rather than better, as is almost always the outcome in a case of lengthy prison sentences, end of quote. The absence of change in the person should not deter a system of incapacitation. Instead, we want the improvement of the individual to occur, but it's not the criminal justice system's job to produce or cultivate that change. The purpose of prison is punishment. Instead, Kuyper says, quote, the freedom of churches or private societies to work for the rehabilitation of the criminal should not be denied. End of quote. The criminal justice system must first be mindful of punishment, discipline, retribution, and to make the prisoner understand that he has brought this miserable existence upon himself through his own guilt and sin. This emphasis on punishment naturally leads Kuyper to support the death penalty. Since the criminal justice job is not the, quote, bettering of the criminal, but only the carrying out of punishment in the interest of upholding justice, then the state of the conflict's soul can never be an impediment to having him executed. End of quote. For Kuyper, the only question is whether or not the state has the right to take someone's life. Kuyper's answer is yes. Interesting rationale here. Pay attention to this. Kuyper says the answer is yes. Of course, governments can take people's lives because it sends soldiers into the line of fire in the time of war, or has them, and this was really interesting, or has them, quote, shoot into crowds in times of mutiny or revolt. Biblically, however, Kuyper argues that the death penalty is permitted because of what is stated in Genesis 9 and Romans 13, and he says, quote, in the cross of Golgotha, end of quote. Kuyper dismisses the objection that the innocent may perish on the ground that, one, the same can be said of the innocent people who might be shot while containing a riot. Two, sending men into war. Three, on the conscientious procedure of the courts. Four, on the right to grant pardons. And five, on the cross, which, quote, even the strictest demand of justice requires sacrifice of the innocent one. This could reconcile us to the most horrible death penalty event if it applies to ourselves, says Kuyper. Kuyper ends by saying that premeditated murders, however, should always be put to death. In sum, our program outlines the principles for criminal justice system that emphasizes the sovereignty of law, the rule of law, and justice as divinely inspired. Key principles include impartial justice protected from government interference, accountability of the sovereign to God, a justice derived from the eternal principles revealed through divine revelation, judicial independence to uphold justice, and access to legal representation for the less privileged to ensure fairness. Kuyper argues for punishment to reinforce justice according to the preservation of innocence and the proportionality in sentencing. Also wants to focus on punishment, takes priority over rehabilitation within prisons. And finally, of course, as is articulated in our program, the reinstallation of the death penalty for premeditated murders. And these are all, of course, based on biblical and societal justifications. Years later in Common Grace, Kuyper would argue, quote, that a government without an administration of justice is inconceivable. Administration of justice without a penal code cannot exist. And a penal code that leaves undecided whether an act is good or evil would not be a penal code at all. Every penal code condemns certain acts as a crime, stamping them as evil. And in order to do this, it chooses sides when confronted with moral issues. Does a murderer deserve punishment, or should we see the murdered as merely a victim of a moral or mental disease? Asked Kuyper. In Kuyper's vision, if the man is a sinner, avenging justice is applicable to him. If he is just merely a victim of moral disease, he is the object of compassion and pity. What matters for Kuyper, because people are sinful, is that they be held accountable and that society be protected from the wares of evil people. If violence is not a moral issue, but simply a medical one, justice vanishes and is replaced by medical opinion, argues Kuyper. Again, for Kuyper, what makes the criminal justice system work properly in a civil society is that it has the correct moral anthropology, with an emphasis on the rule of law and justice as retribution. So when we think about the implications of this for the American system, criminal justice, of course, is a framework in the West, and in particular in British systems and American systems, is by definition anthropological in nature. Whatever you fundamentally believe about the nature of the human person determines how one thinks about the construction of a criminal justice system, the purposes of incarceration, and how one might go about activating reentry. In the social sciences, these anthropological presuppositions fall along positivist and classical fault lines. Positivist and classical theories offer distinct perspectives on the nature and causation of criminal behavior. Positivist theories assert that criminal actions are primarily determined by factors beyond an individual's control, rejecting the notion of free will, and emphasizing biological, psychological, and environmental influences. According to these theories, individuals are born as a blank slate, with the propensity for criminal behavior being shaped by negative experiences or societal norms that condone crime. Biological factors such as exposure to toxins like lead, psychological factors such as the inability to manage emotions, or mental illness like psychopathology, and environmental factors like poverty and discrimination are seen as contributing to an individual's likelihood of engaging in criminality. Classical theories propose that criminal behavior stems from rational decision-making grounded in the pursuit of self-interest. These theories presume human nature to be inherently selfish and compatible and capable of exercising free will. Criminal actions are viewed as rational choices by the individuals who weigh the potential benefits against the risks of punishment. These classical theories highlight factors such as opportunity, a rational choice, and social control mechanisms in influencing criminal decision-making. The American system, the British system, for example, and the Australian system largely is based on the classical model. Now, because of the reality of sin, a Kuyperian perspective would reject the positivist view in favor of the classical one. A modern Kuyperian criminal justice system would support the rational choice theory of criminality and justice. That is, the choice to commit a crime arises out of a logical judgment of cost versus reward. This theory emphasizes punishment as the best means to deter individuals from committing crimes, make the cost sufficiently weighty versus the reward, and the criminal will decide whether or not that criminal activity is worth it. Kuyper, as noted earlier, would be tough on crime. There would be a need, as he said earlier, to hunt down criminals and punish them accordingly, according to the rule of law, without the expectation that incarceration would improve them as people. Why? Because incarceration is retributive. It is for the purpose of punishment. Now, there are several theories of punishment. I'll just run through these really quickly and get to the direct applications to the U.S. system here. One is the deterrence model of punishment. Is rooted in the belief that the fear of punishment can prevent undesirable behavior. Again, it's sort of based on self-interest. The other theory is the incapacitation theory of punishment. This centers on the premise that preventing future crimes can be achieved by removing offenders from society, typically through incarceration. And this is the idea of lock them up and throw away the key. If you're looking for an institution that advocates for incapacitation, it would be the Manhattan Institute, for example. Another theory is the retribution theory of punishment, which positions retribution at the heart of criminal justice, at the heart of the criminal justice system, advocating for punishment of offenders as a response to wrongful actions. The last theory, which is the dominant theory today across most of Western Europe and dominant in the U.S. today, is the rehabilitation theory of punishment. This is one of the reasons we went from prisons to correctional facilities. The rehabilitation model posits rehabilitation as the fundamental goal of criminal punishment with the aim of transforming offenders into productive, law-abiding citizens. This approach has historically been the core of modern correctional system improvements and innovation, suggesting a shift from merely punishing offenders to correcting their behavior as they re-enter society. And this involves the introduction of programs like education, a faith-based initiative, drug treatment programs, anger management, and so on and so forth. So given the framework of the Anti-Revolutionary Party and Kuyper's views in particular, what would the recommendations be for the U.S. system? I have 9. And when I constructed these 9, I thought these would also be 9 chapters. This would be a really fun book to write. The first is this: to align laws with divine justice. Kuyper would likely recommend that U.S. laws be closely examined and reformed to align precisely with the principles of divine justice. This involves ensuring that laws honor God's ordinances and wisdom derived from divine revelation, focusing on justice that transcends human opinions and biases. Second, pursue unbiased administration of justice. Noting the nuances in crime patterns and disparities in legal outcomes, Kuyper would advocate for measures, most likely that ensure justice is administered without bias and to safeguard it against manipulation by higher government powers and politicians. This would involve rigorous effort to eliminate bias, eliminate greed, and pride within the criminal justice system. Third, to ensure accountability of divine standards, Kuyper would stress, of course, that those in positions of authority, from police officers to sovereigns to those overseeing jurisdictions, are accountable to God for their actions and decisions. That this accountability should guide their conduct and their decision-making processes, ensuring that justice is pursued in accordance with divine principles. Fourth, to promote independence in judicial proceedings, given the importance of judges exercising their duties with absolute independence. The Anti-Revolutionary Party would likely recommend policies and practices that protect judges from political pressures, ensuring that they can uphold the laws of justice faithfully and without interference according to the rule of law. Fifth, improve access to legal representation, acknowledging the economic disparities highlighted in pretrial detention and incarceration rates in this country. The Anti-Revolutionary Party would call for efforts to ensure that individuals from lower income backgrounds have access to competent legal representation, thereby leveling the playing field against more affluent opponents in the courtroom. 6, ensure proportionality of punishment. In response to shifts in crime patterns and the complexities of the legal system, Kuyper and the Anti-Revolutionary Party would emphasize in this country the need for punishments to be directly proportional to the crimes committed, ensuring fairness and justice with respect to sentencing. 7, focus on restoration and rehabilitation, noting the significant number of individuals under correctional supervision. The Anti-Revolutionary Party might advocate for a greater emphasis on restoration and rehabilitation by other institutions outside of the criminal justice system. This would necessarily involve intentional collaboration and partnerships with churches and private organizations to support the reintegration of offenders into society, addressing the root causes of criminal behavior and providing pathways for redemption and rehabilitation, noting that the criminal justice system, prison in particular, is not designed to do the formation types of work that would result in effective reentry and effective rehabilitation long term. One of the things that we know in the psych data is that rehabilitation often requires displacement from environments that facilitate criminal deviance. It would almost be like trying to rehabilitate an alcoholic inside of a bar. The idea that you're going to rehabilitate an offender inside a prison, which is a culture of criminality, the data indicates it's highly unsuccessful. The most successful rehabilitation reentry programs occur outside of a culture of criminal deviance or criminality. 8, address the drivers of incarceration with the recognition of issues such as violent crime and the moral factors playing significant roles in incarceration in the Antirevolutionary Party, but likely recommend that these drivers be addressed directly. This could include reevaluating the morality of a culture, considering alternative approaches to incarceration for nonviolent offenders, and addressing various deprivations that contribute to criminal behavior. And lastly, to reevaluate pretrial detention policies, given the significant impact of pretrial detention on individuals with lower incomes. The Anti-Revolutionary Party, and Kuyper in particular, would recommend reevaluating these policies to ensure that they are just and fair and not unduly punitive, particularly toward those who have not been convicted of a crime. But finally, in the end, the Kuyper would maintain doubts about the effectiveness of our current rehabilitative model, but also caution that if we're going to be tough on crime, we also need to be tough on lining up churches and nonprofits to do the long-term work of healing, restoration, and reentry, so that men and women, as Paul teaches, who have been criminals must no longer be criminals, but, quote, must work doing something useful with their hands so that they may have something to share with those in need and contribute instead to the common good. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for that great research behind all of that, to share the data and then sharing the highlights from our program. I love your conclusion there about helping people turn things around to contribute to the common good. That's a beautiful conclusion to that. Question would be on your first recommendation, when Kuyper's talking about evaluating the laws of a land compared to Scripture's laws. How do you think Kuyper would think about that in contrast to, his political career includes much more of a principled pluralism approach of multiple parties, in his approach to Christians and non-Christians working together, versus this approach, for an example, like an issue like gay marriage. That's the Bible and special revelation would say that's, in the Old Testament and a lot of places would say that's illegal, that should be wrong. So how do you think he would, you don't have to pick that exact issue, but something like that, how would he try to align that in a pluralistic society?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I'd be more than willing to have real Kuyper experts to weigh in on this. I think it's in one sense, to me, it's a bit unclear because the cultural context was just so different back then. I'm not sure that framework would have even been in the imagination of Kuyper, that something like that would even be necessarily legalized and celebrated, right? I think, for me at least, what's really clear is the emphasis, at least as I read it in our program, is not necessarily that the law itself should reflect like what the Bible says, but that the people who are in the system, that their consciences should be seared by these divine ordinances, and so the types of things that they might support would necessarily present what God would want. And if they lose, they lose, right? But at least for those Christians who are in the system, they're duty bound by the revealed will of God to at least advocate for those types of principles. And it seems to me that would be the best approximation on a scenario that may not have been in the imagination of Kuyper at the time. Like I said, I'm happy to have any real Kuyper experts weigh in on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank
Yes.
you, Anthony. James Eglinton from Edinburgh. I really appreciated the lecture. It was great. And it's stuff that I've never really thought about in Kuyper before. If I try and think of something similar in Herman Bavinck, my mind goes to his writings on pedagogy, because I guess in the classroom environment, you're talking about the same kind of anthropological considerations, as a human, how free is a human, how influenced or predetermined is a human. And then that gets Bavinck into thinking about I guess punishment and reward as well as closely related issues. But the thing that I wanted to ask about, though, although if you have thoughts on that, if you've looked at this in Kuyper and he's thinking holistically enough to take schooling and put it in the same system of thought as incarceration, that'd be really interesting. But my question is about the arbitrariness of laws and lawmaking and how Kuyper thinks about this, because you sketched out justice as this thing that is intangible, and it's ever present, and it's there to be satisfied, and we live with it. But at the same time, let's say today the speed limit is 20 miles an hour, and I go out in my car and drive at 21 miles an hour, and I've broken the law, but tomorrow the lawmakers change the limit to 22 miles an hour. To me, that suggests that the law itself, although it's necessary to have a limit, it's also arbitrary. Is it immoral to have driven at 21, bearing in mind that the next day it might change to 22, those kinds of fine-grained things. So you mentioned proportionality of punishment at the end, but how's Kuyper, how did he think about the necessary arbitrariness of laws?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, at least from what I read in our program, it seemed that the emphasis on laws, the concern was whether or not those laws would have been in accordance with divine ordinances, right? So, for example, would a speed limit of 25 versus 20 violate God's ordinances? The answer would be no. That's not necessarily, right? That might just be a matter of prudence or wisdom. So I don't know that the fault lines were drawn in terms of whether or not the particularities of a law would be tied to something specific. The arbitrariness is fine, but what matters is whether or not that arbitrariness is outside of what would be consistent with God's ordinance and the economy, right? God's management of the world. There's going to be some flexibility there. In one sense, right? I mean, if you read our program, at least the parts that I read for this, it's a bit of a pragmatist in that sense, and allow some flexibility there. So the arbitrariness of the laws really wasn't the point. What mattered, at least as I read in our program, was sort of a Christian framework versus the secular humanist one. I mean, that was really the issue, is whether or not these laws were connected to the revealed will of God and what God might want for the creation in general, contra the secular humanists. Right? At least it wasn't contra the arbitrariness of law. It was contra what the French were trying to do. Great question. Yeah, Dylan.
So I have to credit our colleague Dan Huger a little bit, because he's mentioned this in discussions around the office. But I wonder to what degree, and maybe a little more contemporary question, but I think it relates to Kuyper. Kuyper viewing justice, criminal justice, as punishing the wrongdoer, and rather than rehabilitating a victim. I think there's a question not simply of incarceration, but institutionalization in any society, that there are in fact some people who may not function well and may even be a danger to others because they actually do have a disease, right? A mental illness, incapacity, whatever, but under the right care and into the right circumstances, they may still thrive. And, you know, in the United States, of course, we had a massive deinstitutionalization of a lot of mental health, in part because those institutions were kind of terrible. But the result has been a contribution, at least, to mass incarceration.
Right.
And I wonder if Kuyper maybe didn't lean enough on his own principles in that he always opposed the multiformity or pluriformity of the neo-Calvinist worldview to the uniformity of a modernist view, and that could that fruitfully be applied to criminal justice as well in a way that would be more just and would lead to a more flourishing society. There are some people that, yeah, it's not a correctional facility, it's punishment, and that's exactly what it needs to be, but that's not every criminal. And in fact, it becomes unjust when it's someone who, you know, doesn't have the capacity to properly regulate their aggression or something like that because of a mental illness.
Yeah, you know, when I was so there are all these theories of punishment, and what's fascinating, of course, is that these theories have developed over the last few centuries. I mean, Kuyper is working out of the categories that he had at the time, and in the 19th century was just punishment, right? And you know, also keep in mind that at least in fairness to the 19th century, sort of the imaginings of a system that could provide the sorts of rehabilitative care that we have in the West today would not have necessarily been in the imagination at the time. But there is a case made for incapacitation. And unfortunately, we have lost the institutions in terms of our mental health apparatus that would naturally be a place to adjudicate and manage and evaluate whether or not a person has capacity for reentry or not, right? And so what to me, what really matters is not so much, or rather, I'll say it this way, the emphasis, it really isn't so much on prisons. For me, the tragedy is that we lack a whole robust army of institutions that can facilitate reentry in a really effective way, whether those be public or private. We need more of those. And given the numbers, the idea that a parole officer has capacity to manage the mental health profile of someone who's recently released is absolutely ridiculous, right? And because today we basically use our prisons as mental health institutions and a way to deal with homelessness and drug addiction, we have lots of problems. And at least for me, and this is something that I covered in the book that I wrote, is that we need more institutions other than prisons. And what the state has done, it's introduced different forms of incarceration, like probation, right, like house arrest. There's a whole menu of things now to sort of deal with some of those distinctions, but I don't know if those are robust enough, and they certainly don't have the capacity to do the sorts of rehabilitative and restorative work that we need for people to be successful at reentry. I think what Kuyper does for us in a good way is kind of problematize the way that we're thinking about it, and to really encourage us to be more creative about both public and private solutions, both to preventing crime in the first place, but then also managing and facilitating effective reentry long term. Yeah, great question. I mean, when at the end of this, I was still like, I don't know. Right? I mean, there's just so many questions and so many issues, and our system's so convoluted. And here's the other fact, and I'll end with this. The main problem with criminal justice in this country is that there is no one system, right? It's 50 different state systems, and then every county has their own system, and then every local police department has its own system. So it's not that America has a criminal justice system. We have a few thousand criminal justice systems. And so there's a lack of consistency in the ways that various states and local and counties and local municipalities manage their criminal population. Thank you.
Join me in thanking Anthony Bradley. Those of you who are familiar with the canons of Dort know that one of the distinctives of the Reformed tradition is the doctrine of perseverance. And so for those of you who have persevered from the beginning of the Kuyper Conference now all the way to the end of the Kuyper Conference, through God's grace, I want to thank you for your participation throughout this event. I also want to pray for the perseverance of those of you who are beginning your journey into the Henry Symposium, which will continue after a lunch break at the end of this session. 2 notes. The Kuyper Conference in 2025 is scheduled to be in Jakarta, Indonesia, March 13 to 15. Those dates are in the program. We will do many iterations of follow-up communication on that. And I just want to highlight one other thing for those of you who've been at the Kuyper Conference and had the folder. There's a new journal, Neo-Calviniana, that is launched. There's an editorial outlining the vision of that, but we welcome submissions. One of the goals of this journal is to be a platform for publication of the research that's coming out of many things, including this conference. So thank you all for joining us. Safe travels if you're headed home, and perseverance to everyone. Thank you.